back with Major Research Designs. And if you have noticed in your text, and certainly in the PowerPoint, there are 4 major research designs. But before we really get into the particular research designs, one of the big concerns you'll always have is sampling. Unfortunately, you're not likely to ever be in a situation where you're going to be able to get data from every person that fits the criteria for your study. So what you have to do is you have to determine what sample is going to be appropriate, how you're going to get an appropriate number of people that fit the criteria for your study. And really what you'd like to do is have a random representative sample. That cuts down on any bias. Unfortunately, it's a very difficult thing to do. So what you very frequently find is people will use a sample of convenience. And when you start reading through a lot of the literature in sociology, you're going to find that very frequently there are young people attending universities, such as yourselves, that are used in a lot of the research. And unfortunately that sometimes has an issue as far as how relevant the research is and how widely we can generalize our findings. So it's just something to be aware of when you're reading research as well as when you're looking at running research. Now the 4 major designs are survey, and in a survey you can actually be talking about questionnaire studies or you can be talking about interviews. If you remember back to the Adler study, they were doing in-depth interviews, and these interviews can be done face-to-face, they can be done over the phone, they can be done in any number of different ways with technology these days. But interviews usually allow you smaller numbers of people because it takes a great deal of time to do an in-depth survey, and it gets fairly expensive. However, you also include questionnaires under survey, and questionnaires are one of the cheapest ways, I expect, to actually do research. You can get a large number of people responding and therefore get a huge amount of data when you use questionnaires. When I did my master's thesis, I did a questionnaire that allowed me to gather information from 2,000 people. So, clearly I wouldn't have been able to have done that if I had been using an interview. The second is observation. Observation can take 2 different avenues as well. You can have participant observation, which means that you as the researcher enter into the social setting where you're running your research and you become a part of it. And this looks a lot like what we see in investigative journalism, that people will place themselves somewhere and take part in group setting. There have been people who've done participant observation in the drug culture. There have been people who've done participant observation by joining religious groups. Motorcycle gangs are another example where people have done participant observations. The other aspect is to do observation, but to stay outside of the observation yourself. And that's something that, sometimes it's a little challenging simply to be in a place and not be of the situation. Finding a way to observe without actually being drawn into the social situation can sometimes be a little bit challenging. The third design is experimentation. Sociologists don't tend to do a great deal of experimentation, but the nice thing about doing experiments is it allows you to have a lot more control of your variables. And if you've done any, taken any classes in psychology, there's a great deal of experimentation done in that particular field. It allows it. One of the things you have to be really careful with if you're going to do good experimental research is you have to have a control group as well as an experimental group. Your experimental group is the group that gets whatever intervention or has the variables that you're introducing into your experiment varied. Your control group, however, has everything, hopefully, similar to the experiment group. However, they don't have that particular variable. For example, if you were doing a study on violence and you were showing your experimental group videos with violent imagery, you would want to make sure that you were showing your control group videos of the same length and being sure that they didn't, however, have any violent content. So you want to make it as similar as possible and leave out whatever that particular variable is that you're actually testing for. And then your final research design is going to be from existing sources. And this can take a couple of avenues as well. There are a lot of databases that are pulled together on a national basis, and really huge databases like the U.S. Census brings together a great deal of information. And as a sociologist, you may decide that you want to look at some of the variables that are held in these databases, and that's the use of an existing source. Another example is doing a secondary analysis. When you're doing a secondary analysis, you're looking at things that have also been published. And one of the most interesting secondary analysis I was ever involved in was looking at the presentation, the difference of men and women in media. We chose 5 different magazines and looked at how men and women were presented in ads within the media as well as within articles. What kinds of articles were being written at the time about men, what types of articles were being written about women. And I have from time to time had students do a similar analysis looking at different things. Most recently, students in one of my gender studies courses were interested in the difference in how men and women are presented in magazines and media in reference to health. So they specifically chose Shape magazine, Men's Health, Women's Health, and there was another one that had specifically men in it, and looking at how were men and women presented differently. And the major difference that was found was that women were presented more sexually overall than were men. So that kind of gets us to the end of the major research designs.